On November 18, 1978, in a secluded jungle settlement in Guyana, more than 900 people lost their lives in a single day. Men, women, and even children fell victim to cyanide-laced drinks. However, this wasn't the work of some tyrannical dictator. This was something far more chilling. The victims didn't fall into this trap through force or manipulation. They willingly drank the poison. This was Jonestown, the deadliest cult massacre in modern history. A man named Jim Jones, with nothing but his words, convinced over 900 people, intelligent, capable people, to end their own lives. This brings us to an important question. How does this happen? How do rational, thoughtful individuals end up so blindly obedient that they choose their own destruction? We tend to believe that intelligence protects us from foolish decisions. We think that if someone is educated, aware, and rational, they could never fall for such a trap. But history paints a different picture. Time and time again, we see that it's not evil but stupidity that triggers the most catastrophic events in history. Stupidity is more dangerous than evil. This idea was famously acknowledged by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German theologian and resistance fighter during one of the darkest times in history, Nazi Germany. While many people at the time blamed evil for the horrors of the 20th century, Bonhoeffer observed something far more terrifying. Stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than evil. Why? How could stupidity be more dangerous than pure evil? The answer is more unsettling than we might think. Throughout history, we have been taught to fear evil. We've been led to believe that the greatest threats to society come from those who act with malice, those who purposely aim to cause harm. But Bonhoeffer saw something even more insidious. He observed that evil can be confronted, debated, and reasoned with. Evil has an agenda, a purpose, and even a twisted kind of logic. Evil individuals might commit terrible acts, but they are usually aware of their actions. They make calculated decisions, and in some cases, they even understand the consequences of their behavior. This means that in theory, evil can be stopped. It can be fought with intelligence, resistance, and moral strength. But stupidity is different. It cannot be reasoned with. It doesn't have an agenda. It doesn't seek destruction with intent. Yet its very nature causes destruction. A person who acts out of stupidity is far more dangerous than one who acts with malice. Why? Because evil has limits. It can be contained. Stupidity, however, has no such boundaries. It is boundless, self-sustaining, and most terrifying of all, it thrives without resistance. One of the greatest misconceptions we have is equating ignorance with stupidity. But Bonhoeffer made an important distinction. Ignorance is simply a lack of knowledge. It means a person hasn't been exposed to certain facts or perspectives. The thing about ignorance is that it can be fixed. When an ignorant person is given access to knowledge and truth, they can change, learn, and grow. Stupidity, on the other hand, is far more dangerous. It is not just a lack of knowledge, it is an active resistance to learning. A stupid person doesn't just lack information, they reject it. They ignore logic, dismiss reason, and cling to their beliefs no matter how much evidence contradicts them. This is why stupidity is so dangerous. It feeds on itself. The more someone succumbs to it, the harder it becomes for them to break free. They double down on their false beliefs, surrounding themselves with like-minded individuals who reinforce their ignorance. They reject any information that contradicts their worldview, labeling it as false or propaganda. Rather than seeking truth, they seek comfort in their existing beliefs. They make themselves unreachable by logic. This resistance to reason isn't just an individual problem. It has led to some of the worst disasters in human history. Time and time again, leaders have made catastrophic decisions not because they were lacking intelligence, but because they refused to accept reality. A prime example of this is the 1986 NASA Challenger disaster. The shuttle was set to launch on a cold January morning, and despite multiple engineers warning that the O-rings, critical components of the shuttle, weren't designed to work in low temperatures, the concerns were ignored. The evidence was clear, the warnings were loud, but those in charge refused to listen. They dismissed the concerns and pressed on with the launch as scheduled. Just 73 seconds after liftoff, the Challenger exploded, killing all 7 astronauts aboard. It wasn't ignorance that caused this tragedy. The engineers understood the risks. It was stupidity. It was the refusal to acknowledge inconvenient truths and the unwillingness to change course in the face of undeniable facts. History is full of such examples. Political leaders have ignored intelligence reports. Generals have led armies into unwinnable wars. Corporations have dismissed expert warnings, all because of arrogance, overconfidence, and an unwillingness to admit they were wrong. Bonhoeffer also recognized another terrifying aspect of stupidity. It's not just an individual failing. It's a social disease. Stupidity thrives in groups. It spreads like a virus, infecting people who might otherwise be rational thinkers. The larger the group, the less likely individuals are to think critically for themselves. This is why propaganda works, why mobs form, and why history continues to repeat itself. When people become part of a collective, they start outsourcing their thinking to the group. They stop questioning, stop analyzing, and simply go along with what the majority believes. And as Bonhoeffer pointed out, the moment someone stops thinking for themselves, they no longer remain an individual. They have become a vessel for stupidity. This is why some of the most devastating events in history didn't occur because of a handful of evil masterminds. They happened because large numbers of ordinary people refused to question authority. They refused to think critically and take responsibility for their actions. The moment we stop questioning and thinking critically for ourselves, we open the door for stupidity to take control, and it spreads rapidly. This is what makes fighting stupidity so difficult. It's not just about debating someone with flawed logic. It's about confronting a force that refuses to acknowledge reality, no matter how much evidence contradicts it. Stupidity is a silent, invisible force that drives societies toward ruin. It thrives when no one challenges it. It is like a disease spreading through the collective consciousness. It doesn't need a plan, an agenda, or even a motive. It simply exists, and that is enough to destroy everything in its path. In trying to understand why stupidity is such a powerful force, Dietrich Bonhoeffer recognized that it's not just an individual flaw, it's a collective one. Stupidity spreads like an epidemic, infecting entire societies. A single foolish person can make poor decisions. But when stupidity becomes widespread, when it is reinforced by social pressure, blind obedience, and propaganda, it transforms into something far more dangerous. It becomes a social disease shaping the fate of entire nations. Stupidity does not exist in isolation. It thrives in groups. The moment people stop thinking for themselves and start relying on the collective, they become vulnerable to its influence. This is why stupidity spreads so easily. It is contagious, passed from one person to another until it dominates an entire society. Bonhoeffer argued that when people are placed in large groups, they tend to surrender their individual thinking. They stop questioning, stop analyzing, and just follow the crowd, assuming that if everyone else believes something, it must be true. This is the foundation of groupthink, a psychological phenomenon where people conform to the dominant belief, even when that belief is clearly wrong. Once groupthink takes hold, stupidity spreads rapidly, creating a feedback loop of ignorance. One person's foolishness is reinforced by another's, and soon questioning the group becomes nearly impossible. This is how blind obedience is born, and it is through blind obedience that history's greatest horrors have unfolded. Dictators and authoritarian leaders have always understood one thing: stupidity is a weapon. They know that an intelligent, critically thinking society is difficult to control, but a society that does not question, a society that blindly obeys, is the dictator's greatest ally. Adolf Hitler did not need an entire country of evil people to carry out the atrocities of Nazi Germany. He only needed a population that was too blind, too obedient, and too unwilling to think for themselves. The Nazi regime thrived not because the German people were naturally cruel, but because propaganda turned them into unthinking followers. The Nazis used mass rallies, emotional speeches, and manipulated media to reinforce one simple message: do not question, do not think, just follow. And millions of people did exactly that. Even those who had doubts were afraid to go against the majority. They feared being outcasts. They feared punishment. And so they stayed silent, allowing evil to spread not through force, but through the passive compliance of an unthinking society. This is why Bonhoeffer saw stupidity as a greater threat than evil. Evil requires intent, but stupidity requires nothing but silence. To understand why people follow stupidity so easily, psychologists have studied how social pressure affects human behavior. Two famous experiments reveal disturbing truths. The first was the Milgram experiment, which tested how far people would go in obeying authority. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment to explore the limits of obedience. Participants were told they were part of a study on learning and were instructed to administer electric shocks to a person in another room whenever they answered a question incorrectly. What the participants didn't know was that the shocks were fake. The person in the other room was an actor, but the participants believed the shocks were real. They heard screams, pleas for mercy, and even silence, suggesting the person had passed out. Yet despite the evidence that something had gone horribly wrong, most participants continued pressing the button to deliver what they thought were lethal shocks. Why? Because a man in a lab coat representing authority told them to. This experiment proved that ordinary people will commit horrific acts, not because they are evil, but because they are blindly following authority. And in a society where people are conditioned to obey without question, stupidity becomes a tool for oppression. Another experiment conducted by psychologist Solomon Asch in the 1950s revealed how people ignore the truth in favor of conforming to the group. In the Asch conformity experiment, participants were shown a series of lines and asked which one was the longest. The answer was obvious. However, the other individuals in the room, who were actors in the experiment, gave the wrong answer on purpose. The real participant was the last to respond, and in over 75% of cases, they gave the wrong answer too, just because everyone else did. Even when the truth was clear, the participant chose to conform. This experiment demonstrated how easily people abandon their own judgment in favor of the group. Once that happens, stupidity spreads uncontrollably as individuals stop thinking for themselves and follow what the majority believes. These experiments highlight the insidious nature of stupidity. It thrives on conformity, and the more people abandon critical thinking, the more it spreads. In fact, stupidity is not just an inconvenience, it's a force that shapes history. It's the reason why authoritarian regimes rise, why propaganda succeeds, and why false information spreads unchecked in the modern world. Perhaps the worst part is that stupidity thrives when no one fights against it. This is why Bonhoeffer believed that it is our responsibility to resist stupidity wherever we encounter it. Unlike evil, which can be confronted directly, stupidity can only be defeated by awakening people's ability to think for themselves. If we fail to do that, history will continue to repeat itself. One of the most disturbing things Bonhoeffer pointed out was that stupidity is not just a flaw of the uninformed, the uneducated, or the weak. Stupidity thrives in power. The more authority a person holds, the more likely they are to become blind to their own ignorance. We assume that powerful people, world leaders, CEOs, high-ranking officials, must be intelligent. After all, how else did they rise to such heights? But history has proven again and again that power and intelligence do not always go hand in hand. In fact, power can create a feedback loop of ignorance. The higher someone climbs, the more removed they become from the consequences of their actions. The first thing power destroys is self-awareness. This is known as the yes man effect. People in power rarely hear the truth. They surround themselves with advisors, subordinates, and supporters who only tell them what they want to hear. The result is that a powerful person becomes trapped in an echo chamber of their own ignorance. The illusion of infallibility sets in. Powerful individuals start to believe that because they are in charge, they must be right. Their past successes convince them that their judgment is flawless, leading them to dismiss any warnings or criticism. The disconnection from reality is another problem. When you are powerful, you don't experience the consequences of your decisions in the same way ordinary people do. If a CEO makes a bad decision, it's the employees who suffer. If a politician makes a disastrous policy choice, it's the public that bears the burden. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Power breeds arrogance. Arrogance blinds people to their own stupidity, and stupidity leads to poor decisions. The result is that leaders refuse to listen, refuse to adapt, and refuse to acknowledge their mistakes until it's too late. A notorious example of this is the 2008 financial crisis. Before the crash, multiple experts warned that the housing market was an unsustainable bubble and that subprime mortgages posed great risks. However, the executives running the largest banks ignored these warnings. Why? Because they believed they were too powerful to fail. They convinced themselves that the market would keep growing, that their business models were flawless, and that the risks weren't real. They dismissed experts, silenced critics, and continued making reckless decisions until the entire global economy collapsed. It wasn't just greed that caused the crash, it was stupidity reinforced by power. Another tragic example of this is the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986. Engineers at the Chernobyl plant understood the risks of pushing the reactor beyond its limits, but Soviet leadership, driven by arrogance and an obsession with proving their technological superiority, dismissed every concern. On the night of the disaster, when warnings began to flash on the control panels, the plant supervisors refused to acknowledge the danger. They ignored their engineers, overrode safety protocols, and insisted that the experiment must continue. The result was an explosion that released 400 times more radiation than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. This disaster wasn't just a failure of technology, it was a failure of human judgment. Power blinded the leaders to reality. Psychologists have studied why power makes people more prone to stupidity, and the results are alarming. Power makes people overconfident. Studies show that the more power a person has, the more they overestimate their own intelligence and abilities. Power also reduces empathy. Leaders in high positions often become disconnected from the struggles of ordinary people, making them less likely to consider alternative viewpoints. Power encourages recklessness. When people feel untouchable, they take greater risks without considering the consequences. This cycle of stupidity is incredibly difficult to break. Once it begins, it continues to feed on itself. But the only solution Bonhoeffer believed is constant self-reflection and intellectual humility. The most effective leaders in history are those who surround themselves with people who challenge them, not just those who agree with them. They remain open to criticism, willing to admit when they are wrong, and stay connected to the reality of the people they lead. Unfortunately, these traits are rare. Most people in power, once they reach the top, refuse to question themselves, and that is why stupidity continues to thrive at the highest levels of society. Bonhoeffer's warning remains more relevant than ever. A society that places blind faith in its leaders without holding them accountable is doomed to repeat history's greatest mistakes. Stupidity is not just an individual failing, it is a contagious social force. It spreads through society like an epidemic, infecting people who would otherwise think rationally. In today's world, where misinformation spreads faster than ever, stupidity has become more dangerous than at any point in history. Misinformation, false beliefs, and blind obedience have always existed. But today, social media provides a new vehicle for spreading stupidity. Studies have shown that false information spreads 6 times faster than factual information. Why? Because lies are more exciting, shocking, and emotionally charged than the truth. People don't share information because it's accurate. They share it because it confirms their beliefs, fuels their emotions, or makes them feel part of a group. And once misinformation spreads, it's nearly impossible to correct. People don't want to believe they were wrong. Instead of admitting their mistake, they double down, reinforcing stupidity even further. This pattern is repeated throughout history. The more people accept a false belief, the harder it becomes to challenge it. Before long, entire societies can be driven by stupidity, making irrational decisions that harm not just individuals, but entire nations. And this is why propaganda is so effective. It's not just about spreading lies. It's about controlling the narrative, shaping beliefs, and making people believe that what they are told is the truth. In fact, history is full of examples of propaganda working to convince people to ignore reality. The Nazi regime, for instance, used propaganda to convince an entire population to accept the horrors of their policies. Hitler's government controlled the media, spread false narratives, and labeled all dissenting voices as enemies of the state. As a result, millions of ordinary Germans accepted horrific policies, not because they were evil, but because they stopped questioning. This is what philosopher Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. The idea that history's greatest atrocities weren't carried out by monsters, but by ordinary people who simply followed orders without thinking. This pattern is not limited to history. Even today, propaganda shapes political beliefs, fuels division, and makes people blindly follow leaders without questioning their actions. This is why Bonhoeffer's warning is so important. He recognized that the only way to fight stupidity is to think for yourself. We must question what we are told, challenge popular opinions, and seek truth even when it's uncomfortable. If we don't, history will continue to repeat itself. So how can we resist the growing spread of stupidity? The first step is to constantly question the information we are given. Don't just accept things at face value. When you hear a popular opinion, a viral news story, or a political argument, pause and ask yourself, who benefits from me believing this? Is there actual evidence for this claim? Does it make logical sense? Am I being manipulated by emotions like fear, anger, or loyalty? When we learn to think critically and ask questions, we become resistant to falling into the trap of blind belief. Another way to resist stupidity is to seek out opposing viewpoints. If you're only consuming information that aligns with your existing beliefs, you're reinforcing your own ignorance. Challenge yourself by reading different perspectives and engaging in conversations with people who challenge your views. A smart person welcomes debate. A stupid person avoids it. When we surround ourselves with people who think critically, we sharpen our own thinking and avoid falling victim to groupthink. Social media has created a powerful echo chamber where algorithms feed us information that aligns with our past interactions. To break free from this cycle, we need to actively seek out different sources of information. Don't let social media dictate your worldview. Look for diverse perspectives and engage with a variety of viewpoints. The more you train your mind to question, the less likely you are to fall into the trap of blind belief. Bonhoeffer also observed that stupid people do not see themselves as responsible for their actions. They obey orders, follow social norms, and justify their behavior by saying, "I was just doing what I was told." This is how the greatest atrocities in history happened, not because of evil geniuses, but because ordinary people refused to question authority. History is full of people who blindly followed the crowd, convinced that they were doing the right thing. But the truth is that they were manipulated. And this is why authority must always be questioned. Just because someone is in a position of power does not make them right. Whether it's a politician, a CEO, or a religious leader, their words should be tested against logic and evidence. Real intelligence is not about knowing more facts than others, it's about having the courage to think independently. If you believe something, make sure it's because you've thought about it critically, not because someone told you to believe it. Don't confuse compliance with morality. Just because everyone else is doing something doesn't make it right. Take responsibility for your beliefs and actions. The next time you hear a popular opinion, pause before agreeing. Ask yourself, am I thinking for myself, or am I just following the crowd? The most dangerous people in history weren't evil, they were just too stupid to know better. The greatest crimes and atrocities were carried out by ordinary people who believed they were doing the right thing. But they never paused to ask, am I being manipulated? Am I blindly following orders? This is why Bonhoeffer feared stupidity more than evil, because stupidity requires nothing. It doesn't plot or scheme, it simply follows blindly until it becomes a force that cannot be stopped. The most powerful act of resistance is to think. Think before you believe. Think before you repeat. Think before you follow. The moment you stop thinking for yourself, someone else will do it for you. Will you choose to think, or will you let yourself be controlled? The choice is yours. If you want to learn more about how to think for yourself in a world that encourages blind obedience, subscribe to Sifos. We explore the hidden forces shaping human psychology, the biases, the thought traps, and the unseen influences that shape our beliefs and decisions. The only way to resist stupidity is to never stop questioning.